Right, let's get into our panel discussion for this evening. So tensions are reportedly brewing between King Misuzulu, kaZwelithini, the Land Reform Minister, Mzwanele, Nyhontso, and the suspended Ingonyama Trust board members. The AmaZulu King suspended 6 board members, including the CEO, Vela, Mngwengwe, and then went on to sack traditional Prime Minister Thulasizwe Buthelezi. But we get reaction to this and really what is necessary for us to see some stabilization there. We are joined by cultural expert and Heritage Development Trust Executive Director, Professor Musa, Xulu, another cultural expert of the Great Empire of Kemet, Mkhulu and Nsingiza also join us. And then for some legal analysis really on where the parameters of the powers of the minister versus the king actually are. We speak to legal analyst Elton Hart as well. Gentlemen, a good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us. I just want to get some of your reactions just to some of the news coming out of the Zulu royal house, and perhaps Mkhulu and Nsingiza, I'll start with you. A lot going on there. The king essentially coming out, and let's not also ignore the fact that in his response to the Minister of Land Reform, he's also come out of that important period of seclusion. Perhaps you can talk to us about the significance of that and how historical of a moment that is for cultural significance. But there's something to be said about how we begin the year with these news. The king is essentially removing the AmaZulu Prime Minister Thulasizwe Buthelezi, and also then moving to suspend the board of the Ingonyama Trust. Your reaction to those developments as we start the year, Mkhulu?
Oh, Thokoza, let's start with the seclusion, period. Remember that according to the African, calendar, this is the month of African royalty. So around this time, in Swaziland and here, there is a ceremony that is called Ingonyama, where, mostly it is, the fortification of the king, and the royal, palace. So therefore, the king was in seclusion because of that ceremony. So these are things that, would happen, in Swaziland. Maybe the timing, of that ceremony between Swaziland and South Africa. So this is what I know that, most of the time, these ceremonies are guided by cosmic bodies. As an example, the moon, mostly, dictates, the date upon which this will happen. Mm. Then when it comes to the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister, there isn't much to comment because everybody that sits on that seat, seat of the Prime Minister is actually, given a mandate by the King because he's the only one who can, appoint a Prime Minister. And not only him, but I would suspect that the Royal Council, his royal council will sit down and come up with those decisions. Then, the king would then, articulate the decision of the royal council. Then when it comes to the Ingonyama Trust, I think and feel that it's about time that a government, releases its stronghold on the Ingonyama Trust because the historical fact, why was it created in the first place? It was created to then protect, the land that was under, the king, which include, most of the land around, Natal, KwaZulu Natal. As to whether in the beginning the initial intention was to protect people's land, because most of the land, as much as it's still under Ingonyama Trust, most nations still don't have, their land back. As an example, I'll make an example. Mngwengwe, a nation in Bakeville, enjoy no land of their own currently. even though still under the proceeds of whatever is generated, in Bergville, is still controlled by Ingonyama Trust to a point that people in Bergville have got no benefit, at all, with regard to their land. We find that government as well is delaying with concluding, this application for the return, of their land. So therefore, I think government somehow not to release the Ingonyama Trust to the rightful owners. Yes, the process is led by Isilo, KwaZulu, but that land, it belongs, to the people. So therefore, I think a government should come up with means and ways on how to balance and actually release its stronghold from, the Ingonyama Trust, because there's no justification. Why is the Ingonyama Trust still controlled by government? Because it is a structure that belongs to the royals that are in KZN. So that's my opinion on that one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we appreciate that, Professor Xulu. This is where we bring you in here, and of course, your thoughts on the two issues around, the removal of the traditional prime minister, the impact, if at all, you think this has for the royal house and certainly for the AmaZulu nation. But then this tug of war between the land reform minister Nyhontso as well as the king. I mean, at some point, the minister speaking to the king after a letter coming from the king telling him that he had no authority to suspend the board members, and then the minister going on and saying that he's lifting these suspensions. This tug of war, what is it going to mean for stability? You hear Mkhulu Nsingiza saying it's time for government to release the Ingonyama Trust to the AmaZulu nation.
Well, thank you very much, my sister, and greetings to your viewers as well. Let me start here because there could be complications. In the 1840s, when the Natal colony was born, land was immediately around Durban set aside for white expansion and sugarcane plantations and so on, and black people were removed into what was to be called the reserves. And later the reserves were then to be found all over the territory now that is called KwaZulu-Natal, which is Natal and Zululand. And those reserves were, in 1913, when the Land Act was passed, some of them were reduced, but most of them stayed at the same as far as either the south or the north of the Tugela River. And then the government considered that to be government territory, which is given to black people to occupy for purposes of living there and settlement. And then there were changes in 1927 and 1936. More land was given back to black people. Then came the homelands, starting in 1959. The homelands, the KwaZulu homeland was established, and the land that became the Ingonyama Trust land today is the land that was under the KwaZulu homeland government, which was an extension of the Pretoria government. Now, the thinking in terms of government is that all land, which is not in private hands, is in the hands of the state. So it can be said that because the KwaZulu, the Ingonyama Trust land exists in terms of a legislation which was passed 6 days before the end of the era, the apartheid era in 1994. What has happened? Then it was actually in 1997 it was amended so that it could talk to the current constitution, but it still has challenges when it comes to its constitutionality. So when the minister comes in, he comes from the perspective that the act gives the minister the powers to appoint the board. The king is a trustee, is not appointed, but he can appoint somebody else to as a proxy to stand in for him. Like the late King kaZwelithini, for 22 years was represented by Judge Jerome Mngwengwe as a chairperson, and at some stage Judge Jerome Mngwengwe was both chairperson and CEO of Ingonyama Trust. So the minister is right because he's reading the script of the constitution and the legislation. But what Mkhulu is saying is a story of how you view the issues of land in terms of traditions and history and heritage, and how it was taken away from people through colonialism, apartheid, and all of those things. Now, the government has done this to address what Mkhulu is worried about. There is a land reform program that was started in 1994, maybe more implemented in 1996, that is going on, and a lot of land has been returned. There's a clear government policy of how to claim the land and get it back and so on and so on. The Ingonyama Trust land is not owned by the king. No. Ingonyama Trust land, in terms of the act, the land is owned by those who occupy it. And Amakosi are coordinators in terms of the customs and so on. So if, as Musa Xulu, I go to Melmot, Panefile, to my village, the land where I am, or Tubeni, the land where I am, is the land that I own. And you'll always find that there are boundaries. And the king or the chief or anybody, nobody can tell me what to do with that piece of land where I'm seated. The king cannot tell me what to do with it, and so on and so on. So it's a complex kind of ownership system, which is customary, but it's not in the constitution like it is when it comes to private land and state land.
Right. And you talk about that complexity, and this is why it was important to bring Elton Hart in as a legal expert then to talk to us about, you know, when you do have those that, and I'll say it now in the past tense for the interest of this discussion, sat on the board of the Ingonyama Trust, saying that, well, if they're not reinstated onto the board, they will take the matter to court and meet the king in the court. Elton, what would that look like in the courtrooms?
But for me, it's even that dismissal or removal of the board members is a futile exercise by the king. It was a baby. It's stillbirth. The king never had the powers. The legislation is clear. The constitution is clear as to what is the procedure. So that act is an unlawful act that he committed by removing the board. It cannot. So for me, in all technical sense, if you go to court for something that's not really on the table because he never had the prerogative. They were never removed because he doesn't have the authority to remove. You can't fire somebody who's not working for you. And that's exactly what the king sort of half did, if you put it in layman's terms. The king acted as the sole trustee. And people normally, similar to an executor, they misinterpret that fiduciary position that they hold to think that they own the thing. And it's no disrespect to the king. I'm just seeing what the law is showing me here. The king never had the authority or power to remove because he's not the owner of the land. He's not the, he's just like a custodian to make sure that land and the assets of the Ingonyama Trust benefit the beneficiaries, and not to say that he can decide what is best for that Ingonyama Trust alone. It must be done in consultation with the minister, the premier of KwaZulu-Natal, as well as his advisors in the royal house can advise him, but also the Ingonyama board members. They have to work in conjunction, and you can't unilaterally remove. So for me, I call it a baby stillbirth. It was never an act, and the board members for me was never removed. They are still intact because you cannot exercise a power that you do not have. It's like the president appointing the National Director of Public Prosecution. The Constitution gives him that power. No premier can appoint a National Director of Public Prosecution. Only the president can do that. The president has the power to appoint ministers in his cabinet. Only the president has that power as per the supreme law of the land. Yeah. And that is what it is. But you should read the Ingonyama Trust Act in line with the Constitution.
But listen to this, Elton. So this is how the king responded to the minister as part of that letter. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it. He says, he talks about a fiduciary relationship. And then he says, and I quote, as the Ingonyama king, you know, I suppose as the Ingonyama, I not only have the duty in relation to the trust, but by virtue of my authority as the Zulu monarch and traditional leader, my duty to the people under my authority authority is amplified. In a clear recognition of this principle, the legislature deemed it necessary to assign a reigning king the title of chairperson of the board without appointment or election in order to exercise the fiduciary duty and oversight on the affairs of the board. How do you respond to that, Elton?
But for me, the king is like sort of half confusing the two issues here. He's taking his position as king, and that is where he, as a result of where he was born from a royal house, he's the king of the Amazulu nation. That's not in dispute. But remember, as Prof. Mkhulu indicated, this land, it was never the land of the trust per se. It was the trust beneficiaries who owned the land. So you cannot say that whatever you're doing, you are doing it for the people, but you sort of have exclude the representatives of the people. It's like you're saying, yes, Parliament, we take away Parliament's functions, and we as the executive is going to exercise Parliament's function, who is elected by the people. That is what the king was trying to do there. Yeah. And that can never, in terms of our constitution, sort of have pass constitutional scrutiny.
You know, Mkhulu, I want to bring you back here because a little bit earlier we touched on the issue of the king firing the traditional prime minister, Thulasizwe Buthelezi, and I immediately think about previous prime minister to the Zulu nation, the late Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the role that he played, and also seemingly being a buffer between what happens in state and what happens within the royal house. So when you have a tug of war that looks like this, the significance of that particular role, that is that of the prime minister, and what, you know, the firing of the traditional prime minister then, I suppose, if at all, does leave a gap, if you will.
Oh, yes, Njavgazi. Remember that, you know, as I said, you know, the king has got all the right, you know, to fire and hire whoever is in that position. And the king might be, you know, in his, you know, own way, able, you know, to deal. Maybe there could have been a mistrust that has arisen between, you know, the prime minister and the king. So therefore, if the king is no longer trusting the prime minister, he's got, you know, all the right, you know, to act in whatever way, and nobody can find, you know, a fault with that. But just, you know, just to comment, you know, on what the gentleman, you know, just said with regard to the powers, you know, of the king. This is, you know, the trickery that happened in '94 when we accepted the Republic of South Africa. And it's exactly the same thing with the Ingonyama Trust. It was demonstrated by the previous, you know, isilo sakwaZulu, Ingonyama, Mdlokomvana. It was demonstrated by, because he was forever complaining about, you know, this pseudo position that they are given, but without any control and power. And another thing, once you accept to be a constitutional monarch, you know, we are then locked in within this constitution, which is why they shouldn't have accepted, you know, to be constitutional monarch and actually demand full control of the land. I think, you know, things will be completely different, because as long as the king has sworn that, you know, they would forever respect the constitution, therefore they're obligated to follow that route, even if, you know, it's just a ceremonial position. As, you know, the gentleman has just explained, the king doesn't have any power, but Parliament has the power, and the minister, he has the power to actually oppose, which is just, you know, something which is very sad. You know, it's an insult, you know, to our royals in a way. For a minister who's just a commoner, for him to come up and oppose the will of the king. But we understand everybody is governed by this, you know, so-called constitution, which acts against every interest, black people.
Yeah. Prof. Xulu, I'm going to let you have I suppose, a bite into this issue of the traditional prime minister. Is that role important? I mean, the king essentially having asked the Zulu nation to, unite behind the move towards appointing a traditional prime minister. Does he need one?
Well, there has always been a traditional prime minister, and the person who really introduced this position on a large scale was King Shaka himself, when he appointed Ngomane Kamqomboli of the Mdletshe as his traditional prime minister. It then became a norm that every king would have a traditional prime minister. But it's not like an objective kind of position. It's mostly subjective. Kings in the past and in history would appoint people they know, people they had gone to war with, and maybe they were friends or relatives. And then later, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi the late made the post to look very lucrative, because Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi understood the traditional aspects of everything, as well as the governance aspects of things, and the constitution and the legislations and all of those things. So he was able to understand that Ingonyama Trust, and he said it many times, that Ingonyama Trust, the king was a trustee on behalf of the owners of the land, and the trust board was as an administrative arm of that for all these things that happen on a daily basis. So he explained that at length. Now, the traditional prime minister will be some kind of person that always acts in council. A king must have a royal council, usually consisting of amakhosi on the main, but also like King Solomon had educated people like John Langalibalele Dube, the founding president of the ANC, Pixley Isaka Seme, the ANC intellectual that wrote it all. They were in those councils, and they were advising and coming up with new ideas. And the whole thing, for example, of commemorating the death of Shaka was an idea that came from the traditional council. So a prime minister works in that situation, but then becomes the link between the council and the king, advising the king on what the council has said, because the king, the position of a king is a very limiting position. Silo Samabandla is a king in council, king of the council or the councils. He usually speaks much little, and because he has to listen more to the various councils that advise him.
Yeah.
The removal of the traditional prime minister would open a situation where the king could appoint a new traditional prime minister, but I don't know whether the whole nation was ever involved in that kind of decision. It's the king that takes that decision, and we expect him to take the decision sooner or later, maybe even during this month of January.
And we'll be watching for that decision as well. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much for enlightening us on this all-important discussion as the country watches on. Professor Musa, cultural expert, thank you so much to Mkhulu Nsingiza, who is the co-founder of the Great Empire of Kemet, as well as Elton Hart, who is a legal expert, speaking to us on that one. Keep the WhatsApps coming in, 072-110-5584. Looking forward to getting your thoughts on that one. You are watching Newsfeed PM, the late edition. More news on the other side of this.